I will teach the last part of the lesson about the French Revolution and the First Empire online. And this video will be about the third part of the lesson. So after the in-depth study of the year 1789 and then the study of the decade of the 1790s, during which France was really torn apart by the political division created by the revolution. The last part is about the longer period of 16 years, during which France was ruled by one authoritarian leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. And the question we will examine is, could this dictatorship save the revolution? Well, a dictatorship it was indeed. You remember that the origins of the regime of Napoleon was a coup d'etat made in 1799 during the months of Brumaire. With the help of the army, of course. Napoleon was the most popular of the generals of the French army. He had organized this plot with a couple of politicians, and the goal of this plot was to put an end to the weakness and kind of instability that the French First Republic was experiencing at the end of the century. But as suggested on this British caricature of the Napoleon coup d'etat of 1799, this should also be interpreted as a challenge to many principles of the revolution, and in particular the principles of separation of powers and democratic regime, because that was really a takeover by force. And clearly it opened a period of great ambiguity, because on the one hand Napoleon would change the institutions in a way that could be seen as a total betrayal of the principles of the revolution, and in the meantime, on some grounds, he continued the work, the reforms introduced by the French Revolution, and really secured some of them almost until today. Anyway, there will be two parts, and part A will be about the first kind of regime that Napoleon made for France. It was still the First Republic, but as I've written here, a 3.0 republic, a new version called the Consulate. We must have a look at this new constitution, which in those days was named the Constitution of Year 8, according to the revolutionary calendar. So the name Consulate was inspired by antiquity, and more exactly the Roman Empire. As you can see on this painting, which shows how Napoleon welcomed in a ceremony some of the members of another institution called Conseil d'État, you can see that some symbols of the revolution had been kept. And if you look at the belt of Napoleon, you can see the three colors, red, white, and blue. So the flag of the revolutionary France was kept. The calendar of the Republic was kept as well, and the Marseillaise remained the anthem of the Republic. But the constitution was new, and in fact, most powers were in the hand of Napoleon. His title was that of First Consul, and even though he was assisted by two other consuls, he was clearly the first one. We may wonder how democratic was the Constitution of 1799. And the first thing that you will realize when looking at this chart showing how the state was organized is its complexity. Many institutions, many levels in the state, and it's unfortunately often the case that a very complex constitution aims to be complicated in order not to be really understood by the citizens. And in fact, there is a lot of ambiguity in this chart, because we can see some elements that look pretty democratic here, and some that are absolutely not. So what was democratic in this constitution? Well, obviously, at the basis of the state, you still had the nation, as defined previously, as all the people, the males, aged of more than 21. They could vote. So the regime was based on universal suffrage, but you can see how indirect was the electoral process, a bit like in the Directory, the previous regime. So immediately with this indirect dimension, you can understand that democracy was far from being absolute. Now, if we look at the separation of powers, we have several colors, and so it looks like a real separation of power. In particular, we can see 4 institutions, in fact 4 chambers, that share the legislative power. So at first glance we may think that 4 chambers means a strong legislative power. In fact, it's absolutely the opposite. The existence of 4 chambers, and not 2 or 1 as before, on the other, on the contrary, proved that there was a real division of legislative power and actually a weakness of legislative power. In fact, only 2 of these chambers were partially elected, and in particular the chamber called Corps Législatif. The others were appointed by the executive power, that is to say by Napoleon itself. And the franchise, the suffrage, was indeed universal, but in fact citizens could not vote for any candidate they would like, because there was a real censorship in the regime. And in fact, they could vote indeed, but there was a difference made between the official candidates of the regime and the others. And communication, propaganda was only made for the official candidates of the regime, and as a result, they could only be elected. Moreover, the votes were not free. They were strictly controlled by the police. Clearly, the regime by Napoleon was a kind of police state. And perhaps even more important, under Napoleon, the press was strictly censored. There was no freedom of speech anymore. The other thing that may look democratic here is the red arrow, which shows that Napoleon could ask a question to the nation and ask them for a vote. In those days it was called plebiscite. This name was also inspired by some political experiments of the Roman Empire. But nowadays we would call that a referendum. So referendum may sound pretty democratic, that the people can answer yes or no to a question. Well, in fact, due to all the conditions that I have described, of the censorship of the press, of the strong presence of the police, most of the plebiscites asked by Napoleon ended with results that were absolutely not democratic. For example, when this new constitution was proposed to the French by plebiscite, they answered yes at 99%. Of course, in a real democracy, such a result is just not possible. So we could define the consulate as an authoritarian government with a democratic facade. In practice, the restriction of liberty was so big and the role of the police so important that any political opposition was really impossible under this regime totally controlled by Napoleon. Nevertheless, everything was not negative in this period of consulate, because in those years, while having this strong control of power, Napoleon made a great work in strengthening the state and modernizing it. As a logical consequence of what had been done before, Napoleon accentuated what we could call the centralization of the state, which means that the law was really the same everywhere, and it was seen as essential that the decisions of the government would be implemented at the same time everywhere in the country. So there was absolutely no autonomy for departments. That was not really new. But Napoleon reinforced this control of the government in Paris on the entire France by the invention of prefects. They still exist today. Every department has a prefect. And the role of the prefect is to represent the state, to represent the government and make sure that the laws are enforced and respected by the people at the local level, and also a role of providing information to the state about the population of the department. In fact, these roles of the prefects are still existing today, prefects being the real representatives of the state at the level of the department. Under the consulate, the financial problems of the Republic were largely solved. In fact, they were mostly solved thanks to the military conquests made by the French army. But in any case, organization of this new wealth of the French state was made better and stronger with the creation of the Bank of France in 1800 and the creation of a new currency, the franc, known by historians as franc germinal. And you can see here these coins showing not yet or not anymore the head of Marianne, but more exactly the head of the head of state, Napoleon. Napoleon also considered that a good state needed a good administration, and a good administration required well-trained civil servants. That's the reason why lycées were created at that moment. There had to be at least one lycée per department. They should be public, which means they should not be reserved to only the nobility, but they would be open to anybody who was skilled enough to join them. And they were really conceived as useful for training officers and civil servants for the state. Discipline in those days in lycée was really military type, and students were wearing uniforms. But anyway, this is the first time a public lycée were created in France. Another thing that Napoleon created and that still exists today is the Legion of Honor. The idea was to reward the most faithful servants of the state. Of course, this principle of reward was very traditional in its spirit. It was inspired by the orders of chivalry of the Ancien Régime that had been abolished by the Revolution, by the way. But there were a republican version of the orders of chivalry. And so getting the Legion of Honor meant that you had reached a certain level of respectability in this republican state. And in fact, with the Legion of Honor, we could say that in a way, Napoleon was creating a kind of new kind of nobility, even though, according to the law, this nobility had no privileges and no different rights than the rest of the population. Talking about the law, what is perhaps the most important, impactful, and long-lasting decision made by Napoleon was the creation of the Code Civil, which in English we would refer to as Napoleonic Code. It was one huge register of all civil laws existing in the Republic. The idea was really to clarify and stabilize the law by focusing on the importance of equality of rights and also the defense of property, so principles that were already in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. And you can see here on this drawing a symbolic representation of Napoleon showing to his wife the first version of the Code Civil that he is about to deliver to the entire population. It's interesting to have a look at some of the articles of the Code Civil because even though, as I said, most of the articles insisted on the equality of rights, but there is one equality that really did not exist in those days, and that was gender equality. Article 7 says every French man shall enjoy civil rights, but I have selected a couple of articles which illustrate this gender discrimination. Married persons owe to each other fidelity, succor, and assistance. That's still true today. But the next article was the husband owes protection to his wife, and the wife obedience to her husband. The husband may demand a divorce on the ground of his wife's adultery. I mean, it was possible for a husband to ask for divorce if his wife has cheated on him. But on the other hand, it did not work the same way. The wife may demand divorce on the ground of adultery in her husband when he shall have brought his concubine into their common residence. So basically, if you were the man, you had the right to sleep with other women as long as it was not in the house you shared with your family. The last article I've selected is about property, and it said, the husband alone administers the property of the community. He may sell it, alienate, and pledge it without the concurrence of his wife. So once you were a married woman, you had no freedom, you had no control over property. In fact, you had given your properties to your husband. Talking about laws, one that was clearly not a push forward was the law about slavery. In these articles, here represented in French, I want to recall that the regime of Robespierre, the government of Robespierre during the Terror, had abolished slavery in the French colonies. Well, in 1802, the government of Napoleon reintroduced slavery in the colonies. And it's very clearly said in the article that slavery would be maintained as it was stated by the laws and rules before 1789. And even the slave trade, la traite des Noirs, was made legal again. So that was clearly a move backward, and the government of Napoleon did that to satisfy the French colonists and slave owners in the Caribbean. Lastly, Napoleon was really anxious about restoring peace and order inside France. And in particular, one of the sources of tension created by the French Revolution had been the question of religion and the relationship between the new state after the revolution and the Catholic Church, which had proved largely a reluctant actor of the changes. You may remember that a civilian constitution of the clergy had been established that tried to impose a total control of the state over the Catholic Church, which normally should be ruled by the Pope according to the Catholic rules. Well, as you can see on this drawing, Napoleon managed to make a deal with the Pope, and we call this text the Concordat. It was signed in 1801, and it was a rather intelligent text in the sense that it pleased the Pope, but in the meantime it secured the grip that the French state had on the Catholic religion. The first article is famous because it said the government of the French Republic recognizes that the Catholic religion is the religion of the great majority of French citizens. So it's interesting because it was not a return to the Ancien Régime where the Catholic Church was the religion of the state, kind of official religion. Here it only stated that the greatest numbers of the French citizens were Catholics, but it implied that you could also be a Protestant or a Jew in the French Republic. And the right to be a Catholic was reasserted. Article 1, the Catholic, Apostolic and Roman religion shall be freely exercised in France. In fact, they could have said the Catholic religion, more simply. Its worship shall be public. But Article 4 stated that the First Council of the Republic, so Napoleon, shall make appointments of archbishops and bishops. So you see, the French state kept the hand over the nomination of the Catholic clergy in France. So anyway, with all these decisions, Napoleon secured the stability and the strength of the French state after the revolution. And in a way, we could say that through all these laws, and even though they were very authoritarian, they maybe saved the principle of equality that had been one of the most important results and benefits of the revolution for France. But pretty soon, the authoritarian dimension of Napoleon's regime would become more intense. And when teaching the period known as the Empire, I've decided to insist in my title on how much Napoleon's power at one point got really overconfident, and that led Napoleon to his failure. Indeed, as time went on, the idea that Napoleon's way of governing France was a real betrayal of the revolution became clearer. Just one remark about the events and the importance of the year 1802, when at the international level wars between France and its neighbors clearly came to an end with the signature of a peace treaty known as the Peace of Amiens, which put an end to European wars and in particular marked the return of peace between France and Britain. So that made Napoleon even more popular and clearly could suggest that he was the man who could create the conditions for a strong and long-lasting French Republic at peace with the rest of Europe. That's probably the reason why it was the same year that Napoleon made a very important plebiscite. And the question he asked to the French was, would you agree that I become your consul, but for life? So life consulate was the question. Napoleon precisely asked, basically, that he asked the French to give him power for his entire life. The difference with the king was, of course, extremely thin and unclear. And of course, the French answered yes. And they even answered yes again in 1804 when Napoleon asked them, would you agree if I became not your consul, but your emperor? And indeed, in 1804, Napoleon was, in a way, elected emperor of the French, but he insisted on the organization of a coronation ceremony, which took place on the 2nd of December 1804 in Notre-Dame de Paris, the cathedral at the center of Paris, in presence of the Pope. So in this very, very famous painting, you can see all the important people of the French Empire at this moment, many of them belonging to Napoleon's family. And at the center, Napoleon himself, with a bishop right in the middle of the painting. And if you are looking for the Pope, actually Napoleon is just standing in front of the Pope, and the Pope is sitting behind him. That's a very, very famous painting by the painter David, the same man that had started but never finished the painting about the tennis court oath. That's a very famous painting, and that's a very big painting. It's exhibited at the Musée du Louvre, and just to show you how big it is, you can have a quick look at this picture that I took when on holiday at the Musée du Louvre with my daughter when she was a bit younger. Anyway, even though she was small, I can assure you that the painting is really big. So the meaning of this strange scene is that Napoleon wanted to be crowned, but not to be a king. So he took the crown in his hands, but never put it totally on his head. He just put it symbolically. In fact, if you really look at what he has on his head, it's not a crown, it's laurels. And they were there in reference to Julius Caesar and the emperors of ancient Rome. He was also crowning his wife on that day, and the Pope in the back was delivering his blessing. In theory, this new regime should have been hereditary, which means that the sons of Napoleon would have become emperors after his death. On that other painting by another very famous French painter called Ingres, Napoleon of the Imperial Throne, you can see that many of the symbols that Napoleon carries are very similar to those of the absolute King Louis XIV or Louis XVI, official portraits that we studied in the past. You can see the sword, you can see the hand of the justice, you can see the sticks showing power. The only thing you cannot see is a real crown. Again, because Napoleon is not a king, he's an emperor. And so defining the nature of this regime, the empire, can be done with this term, Caesarism. Caesarism would be defined as an authoritarian power by one leader, but that rules in the name of the people. Okay? As if he had been chosen by the people. That's the difference between Caesarism and a monarchy. In any case, there was no more reference to republic, because now the French state was called an empire, sorry. And Napoleon did what emperors do. That is to say that the imperial attitude at the international level is an attitude of control and possibly of conquest. In fact, in geopolitics, in international relations, we call imperialism the attitude that consists in trying to increase your control over foreign territories. And at one point, France was at the head of Europe, but pretty soon after that, France was really on its knees. That's the very traditional story of the rise and fall. It happened to France and to Napoleon himself. I said that in 1802 Europe was at peace. Well, as soon as 1805, France was again threatened by Britain and Austria. As you can see on this caricature from Britain of Napoleon, there are many caricatures of Napoleon in Britain because he was hated. Napoleon is shown as a baker, and in fact he's a baker that creates kings. France dominated Europe, and at the head of most of the conquered territories, Napoleon had put members of his family, his brothers, his cousins, on the throne of other countries. So that's basically what is being caricatured here, even though the numerous details could be studied for hours. This map is making things clearer, where you can see in light red all the kingdoms or the kinds of states that were in fact vassal states of France. We could also say puppet states in a more familiar way. And from 1805 to the end of his rule, Napoleon and France were at war with the rest of Europe. In 1805, Napoleon struck first, and his army, known as La Grande Armée, because it was by far the largest in Europe, it accounted up to 700,000 men, because conscription was compulsory, which means that soldiers were recruited and they did not have a choice. And so for almost one decade, France was at war with the rest of Europe, in particular with the Empire of Austria and the British Empire. It's not a story that I want to teach in detail. You have probably heard about battles like the Battle of Trafalgar, which was a French defeat in 1805, or the Battle of Austerlitz, which was a French victory in the same year. On this map, you see the largest scope of French domination of Europe, which happened in 1811. In a way, we can say that in the French-dominated states, some positive things were introduced. In fact, once a country became a vassal state of France, it received the Code Civil, and so it received equality. So Napoleon really wanted to spread not only his power, but some principles of the French Revolution. And yet, in most of the conquered territories, resistance movements and popular uprisings happened against the military presence of France, because the French army was acting like almost any occupation army does. That is to say, living on the back of the civilians, plundering, pillaging the people, imposing important taxes, And that was the case in Spain, that was the case in Germany or in Italy. In Spain, it's a bit more famous because the resistance of the Spanish was very famously pictured by the great Spanish painter Goya on this painting called El Tres de Mayo, which shows some Spanish resistors. After an uprising, they are here executed by French soldiers. And so clearly the French soldiers here are represented as the bad guys, which they were. And you can see how much the light of the painter is being put on the victims of this violent occupation of Spain by the French forces. Napoleon got overconfident at one point. In 1811 he almost dominated all Europe. In 1812 he tried to conquer Russia. You must never try to conquer Russia. Nobody ever managed to conquer Russia because you just can't have it. The best defense of Russia is its weather, and even though the French army reached Moscow, it never actually got it. And the retreat from Russia was a terrible humanitarian disaster, with many French soldiers dying, and in fact the French army never really recovered from that defeat in Russia. Now France was threatened and invaded by its enemies, and eventually France was defeated in 1814. So Napoleon abdicated, which means he resigned. He would make a short comeback for only 100 days in 1815 before a new defeat against the European powers in Waterloo. And the end of his life is spent in exile, forced exile on the island of Sainte Hélène in the middle of the ocean. In total, the Napoleonic Wars that affected Europe for more than a decade made 3 million dead, which is a number that had no equivalent in those days. That is the reason why Napoleon, outside of France, is almost always seen as a murderous tyrant that tried to conquer Europe and was responsible for the death of so many people. 3 million dead, I said, including 1 million French. So that's the end of this very paradoxical moment of the French history of the First Empire. The irony is that the greatest revolution ever that had been made in the name of liberty and started in 1789 ended with a dictator, so somebody who was obviously against liberty, but that dictator yet helped to secure the social changes of the revolution, and notably equality. So we could say that under Napoleon, the legacy of the revolution was partly challenged and partly preserved. The international impact of this spreading of French principles in Europe was done through military conquest, and it triggered in many countries of Europe something that would change the continent and the world forever. And what it triggered was the rise of nationalism in Europe. That is to say, the will of a people to become an independent nation. In a way, the French Revolution had invented the nation, and the international impact of the French Revolution was the rise of nationalism. We can say that the 19th century was the century of nations, and this is in fact what we will study throughout this year, a story that would end with the First World War, the first war between the nations of Europe.